They laughed when she slipped on the marble poolside, calling her clumsy trailer trash in front of 50 elite members. Her own husband pretended not to know her. But what none of them realized was that the quiet woman dripping in embarrassment was married to the man who secretly owned their entire world. Sarah Chen had always felt like an outsider looking in. At 32, she worked double shifts at the local diner, serving coffee and pie to truckers and farmers who appreciated her gentle smile and never forgot to leave a tip. Her husband David was different from her in ways that sometimes made her wonder how they'd ever found each other. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. He worked long hours doing what he vaguely described as business consulting, traveling frequently and speaking in hushed phone calls that ended whenever she entered the room. When David suggested they spend their Saturday afternoon at the Grandview Country Club, Sarah felt her stomach twist with familiar anxiety. She'd driven past the imposing gates countless times, watching luxury cars disappear behind perfectly manicured hedges, but never imagined she'd actually walk through those doors. David had recently joined, he explained, through some business connection, and thought it would be nice for them to enjoy the pool together. Sarah spent her morning wage money on a modest one-piece swimsuit from the department store, navy blue with small white polka dots that she hoped would help her blend in. Standing in their tiny apartment bathroom, she studied her reflection and tried to imagine herself among the country club crowd. Her hands were rough from years of washing dishes, her tan uneven from working in their small garden, and her hair lacked the salon perfection she'd seen on the women in magazines. The drive to Grandview felt endless despite being only 20 minutes from their neighborhood. David seemed distracted, checking his phone repeatedly and offering only short responses to her nervous chatter about hoping the weather would hold out. As they approached the gates, Sarah noticed how David's jaw tightened, and for a moment she wondered if he was having second thoughts about bringing her there. The clubhouse rose before them like something from a movie, all white columns and gleaming windows that reflected the afternoon sun. Valets in crisp uniforms took their modest sedan without a trace of judgment, though Sarah caught one exchanging a glance with his colleague. The marble foyer echoed with the soft murmur of cultured voices and the gentle clink of crystal glasses from the dining room beyond. David checked them in at the front desk, and Sarah noticed how the staff seemed to recognize him, offering polite smiles and deferential nods. She followed him through corridors lined with oil paintings of stern-faced men in hunting attire, past rooms where members sat in leather chairs, reading newspapers and discussing matters she couldn't begin to understand. The pool area took her breath away. Sparkling blue water stretched like a jewel, surrounded by pristine white loungers, each one perfectly positioned and equipped with fluffy towels and small tables for drinks. Palm trees and enormous planters created pockets of shade, and servers in crisp white uniforms moved silently between guests, anticipating needs before they were voiced. Sarah felt every eye turned toward them as they found two empty loungers near the shallow end. The other women lounging poolside looked like they'd stepped from fashion magazines, their swimsuits designer creations that probably cost more than Sarah's monthly rent. Their skin glowed with expensive treatments, their hair remained perfectly styled despite the humidity, and their jewelry caught the light even in the casual pool setting. David settled into his lounger and immediately pulled out his phone, becoming absorbed in what appeared to be urgent business messages. Sarah tried to relax, but she could feel the weight of curious stares and whispered observations from the other club members. She'd brought a paperback romance novel, its cover already showing wear from multiple readings, but the words blurred as she became increasingly aware of how out of place she must appear. The trouble began when she decided to cool off in the pool. Sarah had been an excellent swimmer in high school, finding peace and confidence in the water that she struggled to maintain on dry land. She slipped off her cover-up, a simple terry cloth dress she'd bought years ago, and walked toward the pool steps with as much dignity as she could manage. The marble surrounding the pool was wet from splashing and condensation from cold drinks, more slippery than she'd anticipated. Her foot found a particularly slick spot just as she reached the pool's edge, and Sarah felt herself losing balance. She reached out instinctively, trying to steady herself, but momentum carried her forward. She hit the water with an ungraceful splash that sent waves across the previously calm surface and soaked two women who'd been sitting on the pool's edge. Silence fell over the pool area like a heavy curtain. Sarah surfaced, sputtering and mortified, her hair plastered to her head and her eyes stinging from chlorine and embarrassment. The two women she'd splashed sat dripping in their designer swimsuits, their expressions shifting from shock to barely contained fury. Victoria Blackwood, a woman in her 40s whose husband owned the largest real estate development company in the state, stood up slowly, water dripping from her several $1,000 bikini. Her voice carried across the pool area with the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "How absolutely typical," she announced, loud enough for everyone to hear. "Some people clearly don't understand basic pool etiquette." The second woman, Margaret Ashworth, whose family name graced half the buildings downtown, shook water from her perfectly manicured hands with theatrical disgust. "One simply doesn't run around pools like a child," she declared, her tone suggesting she was addressing someone of limited intelligence. "This is a private club, not a public swimming hole." Sarah pulled herself from the water, her cheeks burning with humiliation as laughter rippled through the gathering crowd of onlookers. She looked toward David, hoping for support or at least acknowledgement, but found him still absorbed in his phone, either unaware or deliberately ignoring her predicament. Wealthy wives and their equally privileged husbands had gathered to witness the spectacle, their expressions ranging from amused condescension to outright disdain. Sarah wrapped her arms around herself, suddenly feeling exposed and vulnerable, despite being fully clothed in her swimsuit. Eleanor Hartwell, whose husband controlled the city's largest bank, stepped forward with a smile that held no warmth. "Darling," she said, her voice dripping with false concern, "perhaps you're more comfortable at the municipal pool? I hear they have lovely facilities for people from your background." The group erupted in polite laughter, the kind that excluded rather than included, and Sarah felt herself shrinking under their collective gaze. She reached for her towel with shaken hands, trying to maintain some dignity while water still dripped from her hair and clothing. Richard Sterling, a pharmaceutical executive who'd made headlines for his latest acquisition, crossed his arms and studied Sarah like she was a specimen under a microscope. "I have to wonder how someone like this even gained access to our club," he mused aloud. "Surely there are membership standards that exist for a reason." His wife, Caroline, nodded in agreement while adjusting her diamond tennis bracelet. "Some people simply don't understand that certain spaces require a certain level of refinement. It's not about money, of course," she added with false delicacy. "It's about breeding and proper upbringing." Sarah felt tears threatening, but refused to let them fall in front of these cruel strangers. She looked again toward David, who had finally looked up from his phone, but showed no intention of defending her or even acknowledging that she was his wife. Instead, he seemed to be studying the situation with the detached interest of someone watching a mildly entertaining television program. The attacks continued with surgical precision. Margaret commented on Sarah's obviously discount store swimsuit, while Victoria made pointed observations about proper poolside behavior that some people clearly never learned. Each comment drew appreciative murmurs from the growing audience, and Sarah began to understand that her humiliation had become the afternoon's entertainment. Thomas Fitzgerald, whose construction company had built half the luxury developments in the area, decided to join the sport. "I've always said that club membership should include mandatory etiquette classes. Some people need more help than others in understanding how to behave in civilized society." His comment earned approving nods from several other members, and Sarah felt the walls closing in around her. She was surrounded by people who saw her as less than human, a source of amusement rather than a person deserving of basic respect and dignity. The worst part wasn't the cruel comments or the laughter at her expense. It was the complete isolation she felt, standing among 50 people while her own husband sat mere feet away, offering no support, no defense, no acknowledgement that she even mattered to him. Sarah had never felt smaller or more alone in her entire life. As the mockery continued around her, Sarah began to retreat inward, building walls around her heart to protect what little dignity remained. She had no idea that in just a few moments, everything she thought she knew about her life was about to change forever. Victoria Blackwood was preparing to deliver what she clearly intended as the final, crushing blow when a new voice cut through the afternoon air, calm, authoritative, and completely unexpected. The entire pool area fell silent as all eyes turned toward the source of this interruption. But that revelation would have to wait for another day. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Sarah remained frozen in place, clutching her towel like armor while trying to process this unexpected development. Morrison's presence spelled different from the cruel entertainment the other members had been enjoying. There was something in his demeanor that suggested this situation was about to take an entirely different direction. Victoria, clearly accustomed to being the center of attention and confident in her social standing, stepped forward with renewed authority. "Mr. Morrison, I'm glad you're here. This woman," she gestured dismissively toward Sarah, "has displayed completely inappropriate behavior. She nearly injured several members with her reckless conduct, and frankly, I questioned how someone of her obvious background gained access to our facilities." Margaret Ashworth nodded vigorously in support. "The incident was quite shocking, really. Some people simply don't understand the standards expected in an establishment like Grandview. Perhaps a review of membership policies is in order." Morrison listened with the practiced patience of someone who had navigated countless social crises, but Sarah noticed something flickering in his expression that the other members seemed to miss. It wasn't agreement or concern about her behavior. It looked almost like suppressed amusement mixed with something that might have been anticipation. "I see," Morrison replied carefully. "And you're suggesting that Mrs.—" He paused, consulting a small notebook he'd produced from his jacket pocket. "Mrs. Chen doesn't belong here?" Eleanor Hartwell stepped into the conversation with the confidence of someone whose family had been club members for 3 generations. "It's nothing personal, you understand. We simply maintain certain expectations about conduct and, well, the type of people who represent our community. Standards exist for good reasons." Richard Sterling crossed his arms and nodded sagely. "Exactly. This isn't about discrimination. It's about maintaining the atmosphere that makes Grandview special. Some people are simply more suited to other venues." Sarah felt each word like a physical blow, but something in Morrison's stance kept her from fleeing entirely. The general manager was studying the crowd with an expression she couldn't quite read, and she had the strange sensation that she was watching a performance where she didn't yet understand her role. Thomas Fitzgerald, emboldened by the support of his peers, decided to press the point further. "Honestly, Morrison, I have to question the screening process. How did someone like this even gain access? Are we just letting anyone walk through our doors now?" Morrison's eyebrows rose slightly at this comment, and Sarah caught what looked suspiciously like the beginning of a smile before he composed his features back into professional neutrality. "That's an excellent question, Mr. Fitzgerald. Perhaps we should examine exactly how Mrs. Chen gained access to our facilities." Caroline Sterling leaned forward eagerly, clearly anticipating vindication. "Yes, let's clear this up immediately. I'm sure there's been some sort of mistake or misunderstanding about her membership status."
Sarah found herself holding her breath, dreading whatever humiliation was about to be revealed about her husband's obviously fraudulent or temporary access to the club. David, who had remained conspicuously silent throughout the entire ordeal, finally looked up from his phone. Sarah expected him to step forward and defend her, or at least acknowledge their relationship, but instead he simply watched the proceedings with the same detached interest he'd shown throughout the afternoon. "Well," Morrison began, his voice carrying a hint of something that might have been theatrical timing. "According to my records, Mrs. Chen is here today as the guest of her husband, David Chen." He paused, letting this information settle before continuing. "And Mr. Chen is indeed a member of Grandview Country Club." Victoria waved her hand dismissively. "Yes, we assumed as much. The question is what sort of membership and whether proper procedures were followed. Surely someone can't simply purchase access without appropriate references and background verification." Morrison nodded slowly. "You're absolutely right about our membership requirements, Mrs. Blackwood. They are quite extensive and rigorously enforced. In fact, Mr. Chen's membership required the most thorough vetting process we've ever conducted." Margaret Ashworth looked puzzled. "The most thorough? For a basic membership? That seems excessive, unless—" She trailed off, clearly uncertain where this was leading. "Oh, it wasn't for a basic membership," Morrison replied, his professional demeanor beginning to crack slightly around the edges. "You see, Mr. Chen doesn't hold a standard membership at all." Eleanor Hartwell's eyes narrowed. "Then what sort of arrangement does he have? A corporate membership through his employer? Some sort of temporary guest privileges?" Morrison closed his notebook with a soft snap that seemed unusually loud in the sudden quiet of the pool area. "Actually, Mrs. Hartwell, Mr. Chen doesn't have any of those arrangements either." The confusion among the gathered members was becoming palpable. Richard Sterling stepped forward, his voice taking on the authoritative tone he used in business negotiations. "Morrison, I think we deserve a clear explanation. If this man doesn't have a proper membership, then his wife certainly has no business being here, and we're well within our rights to expect appropriate action." "Oh, absolutely," Morrison agreed, and Sarah's heart sank as she prepared for the final humiliation of being escorted from the premises. "Mr. Chen definitely has no business being here under normal membership circumstances." Thomas Fitzgerald nodded with satisfaction. "I thought as much. He's perhaps come as a guest with another family." Morrison's refusal seemed tenuous best. "No, I can assure you, Mr. Chen is not here as a guest, but he is present at the club today."
Exactly what I suspected, so we can resolve this situation immediately and ensure it doesn't happen again. Morrison looked around the circle of expectant faces, his expression completely unreadable. "The situation is quite unusual," he continued slowly. "You see, Mr. Chen doesn't need a membership to Grandview Country Club." Victoria's patience was clearly wearing thin. "What exactly does that mean? Either someone belongs here or they don't. This is becoming unnecessarily complicated." "You're right, it is unusual," Morrison acknowledged. "But then again, it's not often that we have the owner of the club using the facilities." The words hung in the air like a dropped bomb. For a moment, nobody moved or spoke, as if the statement was so unexpected that their minds needed time to process its meaning. Sarah felt the world shift around her, her understanding of everything that had just happened rearranging itself into an entirely new pattern. Caroline Sterling was the first to find her voice. "I'm sorry, did you say owner?" Morrison's professional composure finally cracked into a genuine smile. "I did indeed. David Chen purchased Grandview Country Club 18 months ago through a private holding company. He's been conducting what you might call informal assessments of club culture and member satisfaction." Margaret Ashworth's face had gone pale. "That's impossible.
The Grandview ownership group has been the same for decades. The Morrison family has managed this club for 3 generations. The Morrison family has managed it beautifully, Morrison agreed, which is why Mr. Chen retained our services when he acquired the property. He was quite specific about maintaining the club's traditions and character, though I suspect recent events might prompt some discussions about what exactly that character should include. Eleanor Hartwell was staring at David, who had stood up from his lounger and was walking slowly toward the group. But he works in business consulting. He drives a modest car. He lives, she gestured vaguely toward Sarah, with her, in obviously ordinary circumstances. David reached the circle of stunned members and slipped his arm around Sarah's shoulders. It was the first time he'd acknowledged her presence all afternoon, and she found herself leaning into his warmth despite her confusion and lingering hurt. "I do work in business consulting," David said quietly. "I consult for my own businesses about their performance and potential improvements. As for the car and our home, well, those reflect what we need, not what we can afford." The club, the golf course, the tennis facilities, the marina, and about 3,000 acres of surrounding property that I'm considering for various development projects. Thomas Fitzgerald looked like he might be sick. "Development projects?" David nodded thoughtfully. "I've been reviewing several options. A luxury housing development, perhaps, or maybe a more inclusive recreational facility that would serve the broader community. Today's experience is certainly providing valuable input for those decisions." Victoria Blackwood, who had been silent since Morrison's revelation, suddenly found her voice. "Why didn't you say something? Why did you let this happen?" David's arm tightened around Sarah's shoulders. "I wanted to see how my wife would be treated here. I wanted to understand what kind of community Grandview really fosters." His voice hardened slightly. "The answer has been quite educational." Sarah finally found her own voice, though it came out shakier than she intended. "You knew this would happen?" David turned to face her, and she saw genuine regret in his eyes. "I hoped it wouldn't. I hoped the people here would be better than this. I was wrong, and I'm sorry you had to endure their cruelty because of my miscalculation." Caroline Sterling stepped forward desperately. "Mr. Chen, surely you understand that this was all a misunderstanding. We had no idea who you were, and if we had known—" "If you had known, you would have treated my wife differently?" David's voice carried a dangerous edge. "So your courtesy and respect are dependent on someone's bank account, rather than their basic humanity?" Eleanor Hartwell tried a different approach. "We were simply concerned about club standards and maintaining the atmosphere that makes Grandview special." "And what atmosphere is that exactly?" David asked. "One where people are humiliated for minor accidents? Where someone's worth is determined by their clothing or their accent? Where a group of adults finds entertainment in making a stranger feel unwelcome and worthless?" Margaret Ashworth's voice was barely audible. "We were trying to preserve the club's character." "You were preserving something, certainly," David agreed, "but I'm not sure character is the right word for it." Morrison, who had been watching the exchange with professional interest, stepped forward slightly. "Mr. Chen, how would you like me to handle this situation?" David looked around the circle of faces that had been so confident and cruel just minutes before. "I think that depends on what these members have learned from today's experience." Victoria Blackwood, clearly desperate to salvage the situation, stepped forward with tears in her eyes. "Mr. Chen, Mrs. Chen, please accept our deepest apologies. We behaved terribly, and there's no excuse for our conduct. Richard Sterling nodded vigorously. Absolutely. We were completely out of line. If there's anything we can do to make amends. Thomas Fitzgerald looked genuinely stricken. I'm mortified by my behavior. Mrs. Chen, you have every right to hate us, but please know that we're not usually like this. Sarah studied their faces, seeing fear and desperation where confidence and cruelty had been just moments before. Aren't you? She asked quietly. Because this seemed pretty natural to all of you. Caroline Sterling reached out tentatively. We were wrong, completely, inexcusably wrong, but we're good people who made terrible choices today. Good people don't make sport of humiliating strangers, Sarah replied, her voice growing stronger. Good people don't gather in groups to muck someone who's clearly uncomfortable and out of place. Good people don't laugh when someone is struggling. Eleanor Hartwell was crying now. You're right, we're not good people. We're horrible, shallow people who got caught up in something ugly. David watched his wife carefully as she processed the apologies and confessions surrounding them. Sarah, this is your decision. These people hurt you, not me. Whatever you think should happen, I'll support. Sarah looked around the pool area, taking in the faces of people who had seemed so powerful and intimidating just an hour before. They looked smaller now, diminished by their own cruelty and the consequences they were finally facing. I don't want revenge, she said finally. I don't want any of you to lose your memberships or face some terrible punishment. But I do want you to remember how this felt. I want you to remember what it's like to be judged and found wanting, to have people decide you don't belong somewhere based on things that don't actually matter. Margaret Ashworth nodded through her tears. We will.
I promise we will. And I want you to think about how you treat people in the future, Sarah continued. Not just here at the club, but everywhere. Service workers, people who look different from you, people who don't have what you have. Because everyone deserves basic human dignity, regardless of their background or circumstances. Victoria Blackwood stepped forward hesitantly. Mrs. Chen, is there anything we can do? Any way to show you that we've learned from this? Sarah considered the question carefully. You could start by treating the staff here with more respect. Learn their names, acknowledge their work. Remember that they're people with their own lives and challenges. You could stop judging people by their appearance or their possessions. You could use your influence and resources to make your community more welcoming rather than more exclusive. Thomas Fitzgerald nodded eagerly. Yes, absolutely. We can do all of that. But most importantly, Sarah continued, you could remember that kindness costs nothing, and cruelty has consequences you might not see coming. David smiled at his wife, clearly proud of her grace under pressure. Morrison, I think we can consider this a learning experience for everyone involved. No formal actions are necessary, but I do want detailed reports on how our members interact with staff and guests going forward. Morrison nodded professionally. Of course, Mr. Chen. I'll implement a comprehensive feedback system immediately. The group of members began to disperse, their conversation subdued, and their earlier arrogance completely absent. Several approached Sarah individually to offer more personal apologies, which she accepted with the same grace she'd shown throughout the ordeal. As the pool area began to return to normal, David and Sarah found themselves alone by the water's edge. The afternoon sun was lower now, casting long shadows across the pristine facilities that David had revealed he owned. Why didn't you tell me? Sarah asked, her voice carrying hurt alongside curiosity. David sat down on the edge of a lounger and pulled her down beside him. Because I wanted you to love me for who I am, not what I have. When we met, you were working 3 jobs and still found time to volunteer at the animal shelter. You chose me when you thought I was just a struggling consultant who could barely afford dinner at a decent restaurant. Sarah remembered those early days, when David would take her to small family restaurants and they'd split dessert because money was tight. She'd fallen in love with his kindness, his intelligence, and his dry sense of humor, never suspecting that his modest lifestyle was a choice rather than a necessity. But living like this, she gestured around the club, Pretending to struggle when you don't have to, isn't that dishonest? David considered her question seriously. Maybe it is. But I grew up with money, Sarah. I watched what it did to people, how it changed them, how it made them think they were better than everyone else. I saw how people treated me differently when they knew about my family's wealth versus when they didn't. He took her hand in his. I wanted to find someone who would love me without the money. Someone genuine and kind who hadn't been corrupted by wealth or status. When I found you, I knew I couldn't risk losing that by revealing everything too soon. Sarah understood, but the deception still stung. So today was what, a test? Today was supposed to be fun, David said regretfully. I thought we'd come here, you'd see the facilities, maybe we'd swim and have lunch and enjoy ourselves. I hoped the members would be welcoming, that they'd appreciate your kindness and warmth. I was naive about how they'd react to someone they perceived as different. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the sun reflect off the pool water that had been the scene of so much drama just an hour before. Other members moved around them, but at a respectful distance, clearly still processing what they'd learned about their club's true ownership. "What happens now?" Sarah asked eventually. David smiled. "Now we go home to our modest apartment, and tomorrow you go back to the diner where you make people smile with your coffee and kindness. The money doesn't have to change anything unless you want it to." Sarah thought about this. But it could change things. We could help people, make a difference in ways I never imagined possible. We could, David agreed. We could fund animal shelters, support struggling families, create opportunities for people who need them. But we do it because we want to make the world better, not because we want people to think we're important. The idea began to take shape in Sarah's mind. We could start a foundation, help working families afford things like summer camps for their kids, or college tuition, or medical bills they can't manage. David's eyes lit up. We could create scholarship programs for people from backgrounds like yours, people who have the intelligence and drive but not the connections or resources. Sarah felt excitement building despite the emotional exhaustion of the afternoon. We could do it quietly, without needing recognition or credit, just help because we can. Exactly, David said. Money should be a tool for good, not a weapon for exclusion or a trophy for display. Morrison approached them discreetly, clearing his throat softly to announce his presence. "Mr. Chen, I wanted to update you on the conversations I've had with the members who were involved in today's incident." David looked up expectantly. "And they're genuinely shaken by what happened. Mrs. Blackwood has asked me to arrange sensitivity training for all members about inclusive behavior. Mr. Sterling wants to establish a fund for staff appreciation and education. Mrs. Hartwell is proposing we open our facilities one day each month to local community groups." Sarah was surprised by these developments. "They're really taking this seriously?" Morrison nodded. "Sometimes people need a dramatic wake-up call to recognize how far they've drifted from their better selves. Today provided that for several of our members." David stood up and extended his hand to Sarah. "What do you think? Ready to go home and start planning how to change the world?" Sarah took his hand and stood beside him. "I think I'm ready for a lot of things I wasn't ready for this morning." As they walked toward the clubhouse, Sarah reflected on how completely her understanding of her life had shifted in the span of a single afternoon. This morning, she'd been a diner waitress, married to a struggling consultant, worried about fitting in with people she thought were her betters. Tonight, she was going home as the wife of a billionaire with the power to transform lives and communities. But more importantly, she was going home as someone who had discovered her own strength and voice. She'd faced cruelty with dignity, responded to apologies with grace, and found the wisdom to choose growth over revenge. The money would open doors and create opportunities, but the confidence and self-respect she'd gained today were gifts that no amount of wealth could have purchased. The woman who walked out of Grandview Country Club that evening was fundamentally different from the one who had arrived that afternoon, not because she'd learned about her husband's wealth, but because she learned about her own worth. And that knowledge would change everything about how she moved through the world from that day forward. 3 months later, the Chen Foundation announced its first major initiative, a scholarship program for children from working-class families, focusing not just on academic achievement, but on character, kindness, and the potential to make positive changes in their communities. The program was administered quietly, without fanfare or publicity, helping students who might otherwise never have had the chance to pursue higher education. Sarah continued working at the diner 2 days a week, not because she needed the money, but because she enjoyed the connections with regular customers and the satisfaction of honest work. The other 5 days were spent running the foundation, visiting schools, and identifying families who could benefit from their programs. David restructured several of his business holdings to prioritize employee welfare and community impact over pure profit maximization. The changes reduced his net worth significantly, but increased his satisfaction with his work exponentially. At Grandview Country Club, the atmosphere had shifted noticeably. Members were more courteous to staff, more welcoming to guests, and more conscious of their behavior toward anyone they perceived as different from themselves. The monthly community days had become so popular that Morrison was considering expanding the program. Victoria Blackwood had become one of the most vocal advocates for inclusive behavior, often sharing her own story of that day at the pool as a cautionary tale about the dangers of prejudice and entitlement. Margaret Ashworth had started volunteering at the local food bank, discovering a sense of purpose she'd never found in her previous social activities. Eleanor Hartwell had used her banking connections to create low-interest loan programs for small business owners who couldn't access traditional financing. Richard Sterling had restructured his pharmaceutical company's pricing to make medications more affordable for uninsured patients. Thomas Fitzgerald had begun hiring exclusively from local trade schools and community colleges, providing apprenticeship programs that offered real career opportunities to young people from working-class backgrounds. The ripple effects of that single afternoon continued to spread, touching lives and changing perspectives in ways that none of them could have anticipated. Sarah often reflected on how a moment of humiliation had become a catalyst for transformation, not just for herself, but for an entire community of people who had forgotten how to see beyond their own privilege. She never regretted the pain of that day because it had taught her something invaluable about resilience, dignity, and the power of choosing grace over bitterness. It had shown her that true strength comes not from avoiding difficult situations, but from finding ways to grow from them and use them to make the world a little bit better than it was before. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.